The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Personal Testimony versus Data. Hope you're all doing well. Over the Christmas break, I had a number of conversations. I travel around every year and visit family and friends, and one of the conversations was much more enlightening and informative than others. I sat down and had a lengthy conversation about politics and religion and a number of other topics. But the conversation was difficult because one of the people I was speaking with valued personal testimony over data. Now, in the past, I've heard this quote, which I think has been attributed to Sam Harris and others, and I'll just paraphrase it, that is, how do you get someone to care about logic and reasoning when they don't care about logic and reasoning? Is you would have to use logic and reasoning to show them that, and if they truly don't care about it, then you're stuck. And I don't think that's actually a problem. I think that people actually do care about logic and reasoning. This question came up in the sense of how do you get people to care and accept and value data when they value something like personal testimony more than they value that data. And I think the truth is they actually do care about data. I think it's sometimes frustrating to pause the conversation that you're having and go back and have a foundational conversation about logical reasoning, about fallacies. Most people don't understand this. This is one of the reasons why I'm getting back to the Foundation series at a request to talk more about a Logic 101 thing in a way that everyone can understand. And if we're going to have a conversation about logical reasoning, maybe it's best that we don't use jargon, that we don't try to overcomplicate things, and instead address the fact that, do you care about whether or not what you believe is true or likely to be true? Do you care about being reasonable? Because very few people I've met will acknowledge that they are in fact being unreasonable and that this is a good thing. There are people who will say that, and then when you try to dig down this track, matter of fact, it happened on a YouTube video just today where somebody was saying, oh, you atheists, you can't appreciate anything that science can't tell you, and yet there's all kinds of things science can't know, and so you just view that as irrational and you dismiss it. This person probably doesn't think they are being unreasonable. They probably do value logic, reason, rationality, but something is preventing them from recognizing when they are in fact in violation of the principles of sound reasoning. The series that I'm going to start working on is going to try to be a plain language view of that. But today I wanted to talk about this notion of valuing personal testimony over data, because it can certainly be frustrating, and yet it is normal, it's understandable, and it shouldn't be that difficult to get over that roadblock once you know what's actually going on. In this particular situation, we were talking about healthcare and whether or not we should have socialized medicine or whose medical system is better, etc. And I referenced some statistics. By the way, if you're going to reference statistics, you should at least be ready to demonstrate your Google foo for looking them up rather than fumbling around. It's nice if you find statistics that you think you're going to use rather than just merely memorizing them. Put them in a bookmark, add a bookmark folder, add it to your mobile bookmarks, and that way even if you're out on the phone, you can go back to the thing that you're referencing so the individual you're speaking with can look at that, take notes, send it to them in email so that they can review it, analyze it if they care to do so, to find out what's potentially wrong with it. In this case, I didn't actually need to do any of that because they were happy to accept that I was accurately representing statistics, but that they had personal testimony from someone, a Canadian nurse, who brought her mother to the United States for health care. And I probably made mistakes in how I was phrasing things with regard to which healthcare system is better, because those are subjective things in some senses of what you value most. Do you value the potential quality of care? Do you value the cost effectiveness of care? Do you value the amount of time that you spend waiting, how it's handled with emergent versus non-emergent cases, etc. I was just looking at societal health in general, about which population tends to live longer, which population tends to have fewer significant health problems, and as one of the great kind of statistics to point out is that how did having health issues affect their broader lives? Because the number one, or one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States is healthcare debt. And it's one of those things. You can be brilliant and gifted, you can have a great career, you can be a good person, you can be contributing to society, and then something out of your control causes you or someone you love to be stricken with a disease that winds up bankrupting you in many situations. We talked about the access to healthcare and things like that, but at the end of the day, the fact that they knew someone who had told them, I'm Canadian, our healthcare system sucks, I brought my mom down here for treatment because our system is so bad, that outweighed any data or consideration that I could present. Now, it's entirely, in any system, you're going to have outliers. So set aside which healthcare system is actually better under any criteria right now. If we were just comparing two, there are going to be outliers. There are going to be people who did not get good treatment. There are going to be people who didn't necessarily have access to the best possible treatment. There are going to be people who feel that they waited too long, that they didn't get a good enough doctor. There's so many factors involved in the system that you are going to have outliers, which is why it's nice to point out to people that what we should be doing is analyzing the system as a whole and not going to outlier examples. And so the person I was having this conversation with looked at me and said, well, do you think you know more about this than my friend who's a nurse in Canada? And I said, yes. You do? Yes, because I'm looking at a slightly different image rather than just my personal experience. But for some people, personal experience is one of the greatest appeals to authority that you're going to find. This individual works in the healthcare system in Canada. They've relayed information. We know them. We like them. They are trustworthy. We don't want to think that they are lying. We don't want to think that they're wrong when they could be. We know that they could be. And yet we often emphasize the personal testimony we hear from people. This happens outside of the realm of this, when we're trying to figure out in a he said, she said scenario, who we're going to trust and why. There is often a very in-group, out-group sort of thinking here of, this happened to someone that I know, that I care about, who I know is trustworthy. I can see the pain that they're going through, and therefore what they say is going to outweigh any data that you can present. It really doesn't matter to someone who's a parent whose child is dying of cancer that we have in fact made great progress and people are living longer with cancer, and you live in the best of all possible times with respect to diseases like cancer. And hopefully we are optimistic that in the future we will live in even better times. But that doesn't weigh as much as my child is suffering and dying, because the things that are personal to us tend to outweigh the things that are more abstract. And you could look at it and you could say, yes, this system would be great if you could remove yourself from this. It's one of the reasons why I'm a huge advocate for John Rawls' veil of ignorance, to design the type of system that you would want to live in, not knowing who you would be in the system. So you would be randomly placed, and what you get is something that is far closer to a socialized system. You don't tend to get a perfectly flat, communistic sort of thing where everybody shares equally, because what we like and value as human beings is the ability to succeed, but we don't necessarily need as much of a difference between the top and the bottom end of the spectrum as we certainly currently have. So if somebody's not going to value data because they've got personal experience, how do you get them to value that data? And it's much the same answer as I would give for if somebody doesn't seem to value logic, how would you get them to value it? And that is, you do use logic and you do use data, and you show them that in these other circumstances, they absolutely care about logic and reasoning, and they absolutely care about data. Why aren't they being consistent? if you show that on this subject here, they are essentially being hypocritical to their own values, or they are engaged in some sort of inconsistency, they now have to justify that inconsistency. And I don't want to say that it's impossible. It may in fact be possible and correct, that there are inconsistencies which are reasonably justified, or that you may not care as much about the broader world as you do about your friends, something I talked about in a previous video about valuing people close to you. But one thing to keep in mind also is that someone who is telling you their personal experience is in fact relating data. They are presenting their perspective on data and actual facts. It's just the difference is that the one individual who's relaying their perception of the data doesn't seem to have much to back it up with other than, hey, they're truthful, they're honest, you know them, you care about them. None of us would like to be thought to be liars. None of us would like to be viewed as untrustworthy or unreliable. And so we tend to extend that trust, in particularly to people we care about, so that it's subject to exploitation. This is how another way that people get used and abused, by exercising a trust that is on its face perfectly reasonable and yet in the end totally unwarranted, that you've been conned, you've been duped. Showing them that this person is just relaying data is, I think, one of the ways to start getting to, okay, now you have some data and I have some data. How do we tell which one is more accurate? And the question that came to me in the course of this conversation wasn't just, do you think you're smarter, or do you think you know more about this than my friend in Canada? It was, well, why do you trust that data? I trust my friend because I know them and I saw them and they were caring for their mother. Why do you trust this particular set of data that you're using? And that's a great question. It's a question we should ask all the time, because we know, and a book that I've frequently recommended is John Allen Paulos's Innumeracy. Paulos's sounds kind of quirky, but it talks about how bad we are with math, how people can lie with statistics, how people can be confused and misrepresent statistics across the board. Data can be misinterpreted, misunderstood, misrelayed. And so that's a great question. Why do you trust this particular set of data? And there are good answers, and it's going to depend on what the sources are. Are those sources independent? Are they, was this a study put together by the tobacco company to show that tobacco isn't all that addictive? What are the sources? How much has this been investigated? How consistent is it across broader dynamics? Is this a statistic that only applies in a tiny town in Texas, or is it representative of the whole? And the truth is that there's no such thing, as far as I can tell, as a perfectly accurate understanding of perfectly accurate data. And so when we have that in our tool bag, when we're asked, why do you trust this data, we should be able to say, here are the sources for those data. These were independent studies. They were commissioned by, in much the same way I would point to the Templeton Foundation's study on prayer. There's clearly a biased source, and yet their findings were that prayer works at the rate of chance. I think when we can show that a study finds something that is not in the interest of the people who were putting it on or conducting the study, that adds some reliability to it. If you want to show that you have a psychic power to read minds, and you keep failing over and over and over again, I'd say that's pretty good reliability, unless we've been deceived and the person attempting this is attempting to fail in order to kind of confound the reliability of the data. But the other thing that I was able to do was say, okay, I can explain to you why I care about this particular set of data, why I think it's reliable, but we also need to consider what it is that we're evaluating. Are we, is longevity a goal? Is financial security a goal? Is a reduction in suffering of chronic conditions a goal? Because we may need different data sets for those. But throughout this conversation, I presented data to back up my position, and you presented a single note of personal testimony. And when I for me, when I look at those two, obviously for me, and I would argue that this is the way it should be for others, that data should outweigh any personal testimony. There's a reason why we don't allow hearsay evidence in court. There's a reason why we don't have data sets with a sample size of 1, because we realize that those things aren't representative and aren't necessarily accurate. And so the goal of scientific processes that lead to these sort of data is to try to remove as much bias as possible. But at the end of the day, in this argument, it was, well, you haven't given me a good reason to count on or rely on that data more than I rely on my friend's personal testimony. And my response is, well, you haven't given me any reason to not rely on that data. The reason to rely on the data I thought I'd kind of made clear, but it didn't matter. Because at the end of the day, what mattered most to that person was their friend and what their friend said. This is a difficult thing to overcome. If it were trivial and easy, we wouldn't ever discuss it. There would be no quotes about how do you convince someone to value logic if they don't value logic? How do you convince somebody to value data if they don't value data? The truth is they do. They do value all of those things. But there may be something that they value more. And now the effort has to be focused on, should you actually be valuing this more? And one of the best ways I've found to do that, and it's not always effective, is to point out areas where they don't value that more. Because what I tried to do was say, okay, your friend is giving you their personal testimony about a single data point. I'm giving you my personal testimony about thousands of data points. So even if you look at it as personal testimony, don't you value my thoughts? Don't you value me as a person? Am I not trustworthy? Am I not reliable? And what often happens is you'll get to the point where you realize that it's not so much about who they value more or whether they value personal testimony more than data. It's about which one did they become convinced by first. This is another thing that we've talked about with respect to burden of proof, and I'm sure we'll go over it again. But a lot of people have this view that I have become convinced of X. X is now my position. I'm a reasonable person, and I became convinced for good reasons. That may or may not be true, but that's how people view it. And now, when you come to me to tell me that my assessment of this is wrong, that perhaps my reasons weren't reasonable, you have an overwhelming burden of proof. Because if you're trying to convince me not just that I may have accepted something a little too soon, but that I am in fact wrong, now you have to show that I was mistaken to accept this in the first place and that I was in fact wrong and accepted the wrong position entirely. This is especially relevant in conversations about God claims and the burden of proof. It's one of the reasons I've talked about before, where my position, generally speaking, is not you are wrong if you believe that a God exists. It's I am not convinced that you are correct, and I can show flawed reasoning and why the reasons you give aren't compelling and perhaps should not be viewed as compelling by anyone. Not, I can prove to you there is no God. And at the end of the day, it gets back to a lot of discomfort that we have with not knowing, with having placing a priority value on ourselves. It's not just that this was a friend that told them this and a friend that they trusted. The thought process that led this person to the conclusion is all about themselves. And nobody likes to think that they're unreasonable, even if they're trash talking reason. Nobody wants to say that they are anti-science, even if that's the impression that they're giving by saying, oh, well, science keeps changing and you can't rely on it at all. At least my Bible never changes and it stays the same. If that's the sort of conversation you're having, then the best thing you do is point out that the change is a good thing. That if in fact something is wrong, changing is the right thing to do. There's no easy way to get somebody to value logic or data apart from showing them that they already do. And that's why one of the most effective tools I've come across is when we get up to a roadblock like that, pause that conversation and have a sort of meta-level conversation about what it means to be reasonable, about what sort of data would they accept. What data do they consider reliable? If there are 97% of climate scientists are in agreement about global climate change, what are they appealing to stand in opposition to this? And what would it take to convince them that they've accepted a position without warrant? Have that conversation and put it in a context where it's about a completely different subject, a subject that may be analogous but not, directly related to the topic. Once you get them to the point where they're willing to acknowledge this, don't make the mistake of thinking that, okay, now we're done, now we can go back to the original conversation and you'll see how wrong you were. Because that doesn't always happen, and certainly not right away. It's often better to place some time in the conversation, to take a break from a conversation, to say, okay, I'm going to go in and take a look at the points that you made, you take a look at the points that I made, and then we'll come back. It may be the case that the person you're talking to is never going to change their mind, that they're going to remain in a sort of state of cognitive dissonance of, in situation A, I'm going to value this personal testimony over whatever data you could possibly present, and in situation B, I'm going to value the data, and your personal testimony is irrelevant. But there are ways to show that there's some level of hypocrisy there, because the truth is, I'm presenting you my personal testimony about the data, and you know me and trust me, and in some cases you may actually trust me more than the person that originally convinced you. But it's not an insurmountable task, because fundamentally we all realize that we can all be wrong, that we have been wrong. It's not the fear of being wrong that keeps us from changing our minds about things. It's the fear of the consequences of being exposed as being wrong that keeps us from doing it. And that's one of the reasons why, if you can have the conversation, particularly with people you care about, in such a way that there's a safety net, a soft cushion for them to land on. I used to believe the same thing you do, and it was crushing for me to figure out that I had been mistaken all those years. But now I feel much more liberated about this. I am much more confident that even if I don't accept a position, my reasons for that are sound. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.